Welcome back, everybody, to Two Guys in a Stack of Comics. My name is Reed. Mike's still out on his trip. I'll have some content for you this week when he comes back. But a couple breaking news things that's happened out of Marvel. We talked yesterday, had a video about the new announcement of Stephanie Phillips as a writer on Daredevil. But in that as well, there was kind of a larger news, I think, that Michael Bendis is coming back to Marvel. Um, Bendis is an interesting figure, and I think it's kind of worth a discussion about Bendis and his legacy and his career, and whether him coming back to Marvel is a good thing or not. Personally, I actually have rather fond memories of Michael Bendis as a writer, and I know things really went off the rails for him at DC and certainly at the end of Marvel. But I think one of the things is sometimes we find some of these stories, particularly his X-Men run, and I think his Iron Man with Riri Williams, and then obviously everything he did with Superman, where it erases the fond memories you have. But I think you have to really look at the impact Bendis had. And so I want to kind of look at how versatile a writer he used to be. And that one of the things about Bendis is, he gets kind of pigeonholed at the end of his career with Marvel and DC as this guy who wrote overly dialogue heavy comic books. A lot of decompression, a lot of issues that were just discussions rather than action, not really delivering on a lot of dynamic action scenes, kind of swift character changes. But I think if you actually look at the start of his career, he was very versatile. In that, his big hit is Ultimate Spider-Man. That's the big defining one. He had over 100 issues with him, Mark Bagley. Um, and I think because it's been so much time, you forget how good that run was. One of the things is I recently kind of went back and read, probably the first 60, 70 issues of that run, and you just forget how entertaining that comic book was and how much it felt fresh, unique, but also 100% authentic to Peter Parker as a character. He really was one of the better Peter Parker writers we ever had, despite it being that ultimate continuity. I think the other thing that really comes in handy with him is then you have this stark contrast where he goes and writes a lot more mature stuff, like his Daredevil run, and then Jessica Jones. And one of the things that he did with Alias and with Daredevil is he kind of again showed this versatility as a writer, and that there's really, if you go Alias and Ultimate Spider-Man, there's such a stark contrast in those two books. It's hard to believe they would come from the same writer, and yet he perfectly nailed kind of the vibe for both of those. His Daredevil work in particular, because Daredevil's had some struggles recently. I've been going back and reading all the runs. Man, there's so many incredible issues and arcs that he delivered and risks that he took with Matt Murdock. But overall, so many of those, just absolutely work. And I think, you look at a comic like Daredevil, his versatility in working with, writers and creators like Alex Maleev, and then you look at Mark Bagley. I mean, two drastically different, artists, and yet he was able to find ways to write for those two artist sensibilities in such a perfect way. I think you have to give him a ton of credit. I think the other thing is, we look at his Marvel work outside of those two. The Avengers is probably the thing that he left the biggest impact on, and that was really a brand that was in a lot of trouble. And what he did to revive the Avengers, to make the Avengers interesting. I know there's people, myself included, who aren't a fan of the fact that he had characters like Wolverine join the Avengers, but he knew what he needed to do to make that book work and to make it a hit and to give fans what they wanted. And I think one of the things is, we used to critique a lot of Bendis's work as comic book fans, I think, because the comic book market was stronger. But what I will say is in his heyday, he was really good at playing the hits, kind of understanding what comic book fans really wanted to see. And I think that's such a stark contrast to where we are now, where they intentionally won't give us what we want. You can say it maybe wasn't the greatest creative decision, but the fact that Bendis, maybe through Marvel's influence, but that he looked and said, "Hey, let's do the Avengers with Spider-Man and Luke Cage and Wolverine, and throw a lot of the characters everybody wants to see on the same team." It seems so obvious to do that, because hey, fans are probably going to buy the book, and yet, we complained about it at that time, and then now we have where they won't give us X-Men with the classic roster. They won't give us what we want out of it. And so I think there is a tremendous amount of credit that he deserves for what he did there. I think even, time is kinder to his stuff like Guardians of the Galaxy and I would say even stuff that he did later in his Marvel career, like his X-Men run at the start. We kind of remember how badly his X-Men run fell apart, but those initial arcs were pretty strong. And I think one of the things about Bendis is where I will always give him credit is he is a man who does love the comic book medium. I think he's written several books on writing comic books, and when he was interviewed and when he was talked about things went wrong at times for him, and some of his runs didn't go the greatest. But it was never because he didn't love comics. It was never because he was trying to stick it to fans or that he felt the medium would be better if it was more cinematic or some of the things that we see now out of creatives where they kind of treat the comic book medium like this thing they're forced to do. Mike and I have talked a lot on the channel about the fact that we've had so many writers come out and say, like, I don't like comic books. I'm not a fan. I didn't really want to write comics. Marvel offered me this job. Folks who are more political writers or, folks who just didn't really have an interest in comic books or superheroes. And then they end up in charge of a book. It ends up being a disaster. And I think the one thing you can't question on Bendis is he did love comics. He did want it to be good. And I think that alone earns him some credit. As far as the things that went bad for him, and I think mainly this goes to he kind of tried to pull the same trick over and over again. The success of Miles Morales. And, look, I'm not a fan of Miles. I don't like the character, but unquestionably, Miles was a breakout character of the Ultimate Universe. And again, I think he deserves a ton of credit for when he had Miles. Miles was in a separate continuity. I think one of the big issues that I've had with Miles is Miles being in the main continuity with Peter Parker, I think is a stupid idea. But, with the Ultimate Universe, he ultimately was the guy who wrote every issue of Ultimate Spider-Man. And if anybody was going to make that call, he had the right to do it. And I think it was executed well. And being in this offshoot universe, that was kind of why people liked that universe, is that it did take gambles like that. And so you have to give him success on Miles as well. It's those ones that he tried after with like Riri Williams and Naomi that didn't work. And I think a lot of that is he got too much. I think he got too much power. I think he got too much ability to do what he wanted. And so I think Bendis coming back after having things kind of go wrong and go awry, and him having to go to, kind of almost like comics no man's land the last couple of years. I do think we have a good chance of getting a good Brian Michael Bendis kind of run of comic books again. And then I think I would imagine he has done some self reflection on some things that didn't work. And in comparison to what we have on the market now, as much as I used to complain about some of Brian Michael Bendis' comics, he was always really good at delivering an initial arc. He was always at least good at intriguingly bringing good artists to the forefront and having comics that at least looked good. And that's better than we're doing right now. And so I think it is the right time for a writer like him, and that his track record is so successful compared to what we have on the market now. And he has not just a few good runs, he's got hundreds of comic books to his name that are good, that are enjoyable, that are entertaining, that hold up 20 years later. And so I think, we so often attribute his career to the negatives that happened, and it kind of washes out all the positives he did. He could be like anybody else who just went through a down period of time. And I think he does have a love for the medium. And I think if you look outside of comics, we've had so many actors and athletes and different folks who have had their peak, they've done great, and then they have a crash, and then they rebuild and they come back. You look at someone like Keanu Reeves, right? He was a huge star for a while, kind of disappeared for a bit, and then John Wick sort of relaunched him to where he became, great again. And I think that's what could happen for Bendis, is that maybe he hit a low point. I think for DC, one of the things is his Superman run went so badly. Um, and I think that largely to me was just, I think DC didn't know what to do with the character, and they kind of let him do whatever he wanted to do. And there's no excuses for how bad that went. But even at DC, the Batman run that he did, it's only 6 issues, and it kind of disappeared because it was in those like Walmart 100-page giant things they were doing, and they reprinted it later. But it was a really solid story. And so I think he does have a good voice for a lot of characters. He may not be the right creative for Iron Man. He may not be the right creative for Spider-Man, or not Spider-Man, Superman. But I do think there are enough characters on the marketplace that would be massively improved with Brian Michael Bendis writing them, and with the collection of talent that he has had work as his collaborators. If he can get some of those artists like an Alex Maleev or a Mark Bagley to come back and work with him on some of these things, we could be in for some really good comics. So I'm really excited to see him come back. I don't know if it will work. It could blow up and do poorly, but I think Brian Michael Bendis, what I would say is he gets so much crap. But I would encourage folks, if you haven't read some of his comics, or the last stuff that you read was his Iron Man or Naomi or his rather poor Legion of Superheroes or things like that. I would say go back and read Ultimate Spider-Man, go back and read Alias, go back and read Daredevil, back and read his Avengers stuff. And I think you'll see quite a bit there that's like, wow, this is a lot better than we have in the markets today. And I think I'm hoping he's successful. I think it's a good move. I think if he comes back to Marvel full time and gets a couple books, not only will those be exciting, I think there's a good chance they're successful and better than we've gotten the last couple of years. But I'd be interested to see what are your thoughts down below. What do you think of Brian Michael Bendis possibly returning to Marvel full time? Is there a series that you think he would be a good fit for? One that he would work on? In all honesty, I mean, if he took over the Avengers again, I think that would be a good thing. I think that book, unfortunately, has kind of fallen through the cracks and been pretty irrelevant for a while. So I think that's the clear landing point. Would have loved to see him on Daredevil, but I think the Avengers would be a good landing point for him. But let me know what your thoughts down below. As always, folks, thank you for watching. God bless you. Hope you have a great rest of your day.